Welcome, everybody to this week's Left Reckoning stream. Hope that you're doing good wherever you may be. I'm doing mighty fine, I must say. We had a really great night last night with our second Left Reckoning virtual meetup. We're going to be doing a few more of those at least 4 times a year. So thanks to everybody so much who came out, and yeah, if you missed it this time, keep your eye out for the next one because they're a hell of a lot of fun. It's really nice seeing everybody and hanging out a little bit. We got some stuff to get to today. As always, feel free jumping in with any questions or topics you might want to hear me discuss in the chat. We got some fun stuff coming up for everybody the next few weeks, but most notably, remember that Matt Leck, myself, Dr. Ben Burgess, Jason Miles of This Is Revolution, Danny Bester, Nando Villa, Anna Kasparian, and more are going to be joining us in Los Angeles on October 23rd for our first Left Reckoning joint live show with all of our friends. So really excited to be able to hit the road again. That's going to be at the Terragram Ballroom in Los Angeles, October 23rd, evening show, something around 7 or something like that. So be sure to grab your tickets because we are very damn excited to see everyone's faces again. It's been too long. I really missed doing that when the pandemic hit. And yeah, y'all, I mean, just one last pitch if you did. Oh, I gotta get my stage directions back down. But if y'all want to get a hat or t-shirt or anything like that, you can go over to leftreckoning.com/store. They've been flying off the shelves. So been really excited to see everybody rocking those around and sending us pictures. And if you've gotten yours, feel free, to take a picture yourself and tag us on social media. We've been sharing those, which has been really nice seeing all those out in the street. But yeah, y'all, snag some of those tickets. Come see us. Next week, we'll be doing another one of our live joint crossover streams with our friends at This Is Revolution. If you missed it yesterday, I was on the Jackman Show talking about patriotism and socialism and whether or not those two things could ever meet. I've gotten some fun feedback so far. I hope that y'all check that out. Let me know what you think. We'll be doing a couple things with some of our friends in the UK soon, too, talking about climate change, etc. So a lot cooking. So keep your eyes out for all of that. But let's get into this first story, and then as I'm going, y'all feel free to jump in. I'll be taking some questions just off the top. We have our friend Sean who says, "Hey David, you seen the recent Some More News? Really good critique of PG&E. I'm assuming." But I could be wrong there. If it is about PG&E, I would love to watch that. I've done a lot covering that provider over the years, so I'd be definitely excited to see that. And our friend Charles Ghost says, "Are y'all going to visit Hassan?" I'd be happy to see Hassan if he's around. I think a lot of folks will be at the show, if not on stage in the audience. So it'll be a good time to show up and meet some folks that y'all see on the screens. Well, let's get to this opening story here. And then I will be happy to take any kind of questions or things that you might want to be talking about. But this one was, quite shocking. I mean, we've been seeing this sort of burning up for a little while. But there's two ways to understand this story, right? One is a story of privation by private companies. It's another example of how tech really is just finding a way to try to skirt financial regulations. But it also is a story that really shows the desperate state that many, many Americans are in right now. And I think it's worthwhile to highlight these things because there have been these fantastical narratives about the state of the American working class that we see from some people, even on the left, which I think are worthwhile to be pushing back on. This was a piece in the New York Times by Priya Krishna called "Would You Take Out a Loan to Buy This Week's Groceries? Americans are increasingly turning to buy now, pay later services for food and other everyday essentials, and there are signs that the practice is putting some in deep debt. Josh Roberts didn't think twice about taking out a loan to pay for groceries. It was early in the pandemic, and he was making $16.50 an hour working for a tech company in Cincinnati while supporting his sister and her girlfriend. We were just not making enough to live, he said. So he started buying groceries online using a virtual credit card from Klarna, a buy now, pay later service that allowed him to break payments into smaller installments that could be made over several weeks with no interest. And we've talked a lot about some of these companies, how they're preying on people, particularly how they're sort of sitting in between people and clothing or things like that. But this new shift here, um, I think, is extremely worrying for a few reasons. So let's get to this next bit. So the fellow we were just talking about, he started buying groceries online using a virtual credit card from Klarna. Soon, Mr. Roberts, 30, was regularly spending beyond his means on food. And I want y'all to note the beyond his means, by the way, what we're talking about. We're talking about chicken breasts, bananas, chips, and cereal. I mean, not really luxury items by any stretch of the imagination. He fell behind on payments and ended up owing more than $1,000 to Klarna, an estimated 100 of it in late fees. He already had about $11,000 in student debt and another $2,000 in unpaid medical bills. I don't want to go into debt for a carrot, he said, but you have got to do what you have got to do. And as Snackweight says down there, is like, absolutely, this is extremely dystopian. And this just goes to show that the kind of glittering new capitalism that we're in, where you have a nice app that you can use to help you, float you each month, is just the old school kind of privation and targeting of poor and working class people that we've been seeing for a long time. One of the big themes of this show, and particularly a lot of Matt's work, is to prove to folks who might be confused about this reality that, the tech industry isn't really innovating too much as they're trying to find ways to move quickly and avoid basic kind of financial regulations and bring back old and very nasty forms of exploitation. Pay later companies are already commonplace in countries like South Korea and Australia. Buoyed by inflation and the rise in e-commerce, they have quickly gained a foothold in the United States, where $45.9 billion in pay later transactions were made online in 2021, up from $15.3 billion the year before, according to Global Data, a data analytics company. Right, and this is one thing that we have all been noticing as contrary to the arguments that we've been getting from those on the right who are saying that, oh, those stimulus payments that people were getting during the COVID pandemic, have been hurting the economy and making workers too comfortable. Truly, what we have actually seen has been a massive extension of debt to working people, and in this case, being used to buy some of the most basic services out there. Going back to the piece, buy now, pay later companies have really. This is from our friend Jathan Sadowski, author of Too Smart: How Digital Capitalism is Extracting Data, Controlling Our Lives, and Taking Over the World. Also, the co-host of the absolutely wonderful This Machine Kills podcast, and it's been a regular guest on this program as well. Jason said, buy now, pay later companies have really insidiously and ingeniously kind of like marketed themselves and advertised themselves as, I'm just your friend, I'm just here to help you out. And whenever we've done anything on these companies like Affirm, like Klarna, these pay later companies, I'll always get someone jumping in and saying, "Look, well, I use these," and it's like, fine, I'm happy that you have some access to capital, but you should understand that these things are targeting you and they're trying to encourage you to spend beyond your means so that they can take advantage of you. And the fact here that their role in food purchasing, and that we're seeing this really, really dystopian system where people are using these things to buy a pizza, should not make you very confident about the state of the American economy, and certainly not very confident in the state of the working people in this country. Food, which accounted for about 6% of those purchases, appears to be an important part of the growth. In the last year, Zip, a company based in Sydney, Australia, says it has seen a 95% growth in U.S. grocery purchases and 64% growth in restaurant transactions. Klarna reports that more than half of the top 100 items its app users are buying from national retailers are grocery or household items. Zilch says groceries and dining out account for 38% of its transactions. So again, nothing new to see people, going into debt in this country. But the way that these new financial companies are setting themselves up, it's not even just to kind of stimulate the consumer economy. It's literally people using these as options of last resort because they can't get credit for other things like a credit card because they're very likely maxed out on all of those. Their wages are too low to sustain themselves, and in comes these new companies offering a very friendly and nice version of capital and capitalism. Um, that is preying upon people. As we saw earlier, this person going into debt, thousands of dollars to basically pay for groceries for his struggling family. I mean, it's really really dystopian stuff. And if we go further, this is all baked into the business model. Pay later users tend to be economically vulnerable. So the people who they're preying upon are people who are economically vulnerable. A July report by the financial services company Fitch Ratings found that they carry more debt than the general population and that more than 41% of applicants have a poor credit history. The report showed that delinquency rates for some pay later services more than doubled from June 2021 to last March, from 1.7% to 4.1% at Afterpay, for example, while delinquency rates for major credit card companies remained unchanged at roughly 1.4%. And this ain't about putting a halo on Visa and MasterCard, but those have to operate with certain regulations about how they can lend money and who they can lend money to. And these companies, for the most part, their innovation is having a slick website, sitting there at the checkout counter when you're trying to pay, and finding ways to skirt basic kind of financial regulations, which are meant to make sure that these kind of very highly risky loans aren't being made to people who might not have the ability to pay, right? And the solution is increased social services, better wages. And the solution that we're getting from tech capitalism is let's just find a way to prey upon the most needy in the society, and skirt basic kind of financial regulations. Going forward a little bit, Chris Browning, a financial analyst who hosts a podcast, Popcorn Finance, said the growing use of loans for something as basic as food signals a weak social safety net. Some states have recently ended or scaled back food stamp benefits. Um, Even though more than 23 million Americans reported being sometimes or often food insecure in June, according to census data. Without programs to meet people's essential needs, something needs to come to fill in the gap. And when it is based on consumerism and capitalism, this is what fills the gap. Companies coming in to make these purchases more attainable for folks, even if they are downsides. And Hannah says, yes, I hate how these financing options are marketed. Oh, you can afford this, friend. Just look at how we break down the cost for you. Yeah, I think that the marketing of these is extremely insidious. And the fact is that what people are using these for are basic things like trying to buy groceries. For people who just joined us, we were talking about one of the subjects of the story in the New York Times about these kind of pay later companies, was somebody who was saying, um, that they had been using these companies and went into serious debt with them to pay for food items. And these aren't luxury food items. The food items that this person were buying were things like chicken breasts and bananas and chips, right? I mean, just kind of basic foodstuffs that you need to sustain yourself and sustain your family. This isn't somebody saying like, "Oh, I have a big steak dinner coming up and I want to, pay that over time," right? Which is still absolutely ridiculous in a country like the United States, that people are in that situation where being able to have maybe a holiday meal or a special occasion meal is so unattainable and difficult that people are having to go into debt and finance those things. But even if that were the case, that would be one thing. What these things are being used for are for buying very very basic foodstuffs because people aren't able to make it month to month in this economy. So all this bullshit that you're getting from the Biden administration and from the Federal Reserve about how the economy is too hot and it's time to cool those jets a bit, is frankly bullshit. When it comes to this country, I think one of the most dangerous things that regularly happens, from talking about the financial state of the U.S. economy to talking about climate change, is that people forget sometimes when they do analysis that America is a class society, and there are people at the top who have been doing very well for a long ass time, while the rest of us are very much struggling to get by. And while the systems are changing a bit, while the companies behind this debt have different names and nicer websites, etc., the same kind of story is being told. Um, And before I get to questions, I want to re-up this again, because I'm just going to be quite blunt. I am very tired of this very unproductive conversation that we're seeing happen here in a lot of the U.S. left, where they think that to have solidarity with the rest of the world means making it seem like the picture in America is one of comfort when it's not. Maybe some people get more baubles and Happy Meals and things like that than in other countries. But when people are going into debt to buy foodstuffs, that shows that this is a very, very damaged society and one that needs changing rapidly. This just came out from STAT, which studies U.S. healthcare. U.S. life expectancy drops sharply, the second consecutive decline. Americans born in 2021 can expect to live for just 76.1 years, the lowest life expectancy since 1996. I was 4 then. I think a lot of people who are listening to this probably were born after that, which means you have lived through a period in American life where life expectancy has gone down every year since you were a child, right? That is not a healthy and thriving society. The COVID-19 pandemic is the primary cause of the decline. However, increases in the number of people dying from overdose and accidents is also a significant factor. And this is the graph they have here, just to make it clear for folks. You see 1996 to today. For decades, Americans saw steady rising life expectancies. Efforts to reduce smoking contributed to this increase in the 90s and 2000s because fewer people were dying of related conditions like cardiovascular disease. American mortality data has been collected since at least 1900. But American life expectancy began to stagnate around 2010, while other developed countries continued to see gains. There's something unique here, that the war against working people in this country is so fucking advanced that even in the United States, right, a country of extreme wealth, that wealth has not meant a better or more comfortable life for the vast majority of people. And we're seeing it in the life expectancy standards. We're seeing it in things like these companies that are preying against poor people. I bring this up, one, because you should be alarmed about these things as individual issues, but two, because this really does show that we have a hell of a lot of work that needs to be done to improve the standard of living of people in this country and people globally. And I think sometimes there's a very myopic fixation with saying, well, if we, relatively compare different standards of living, Americans are very, very well off. I was like, well, what effectively are you arguing for here? That this is the plateau? That this is as good as we can do as a society? I mean, that's quite a pessimistic outlook on politics and what the hell you're even trying to do by engaging in it, or, being involved in these fights. I mean, this is a dire, dire situation, and it's been dire for a very long time. Um, and we need to find and build movements that can claw our way out of this and build a much better world for ourselves and for everyone else. These things should shock you. They should not lead you to fall into despair. They should encourage you to act and take seriously the fight that we're in, and the forces that we're up against, because they're not going to save you. Innovation at the top is not going to save you. The tech revolution is not going to save you. And from everything that we're seeing in politics right now, the National Democratic Party and certainly the Republican Party are not going to save you either. It's up to us. But let's see. I'd be happy to hear what y'all's thoughts are. I'm going to go back up the chat. Um, and we'll go down from there. How about that? Champagne Humanist, happy to hear you. Says the Jackman segment on patriotism was really good. I'm happy to hear that. Y'all should check that out. I always love hanging out with Jen and Kale as well. Our friend Daredevil, how's it going, friend? Says when I was a contract worker, I used to get paid through an app once a month, and they were always trying to get me to borrow money early, a prompt for any action I took on it. Yeah, it's really, really nasty. MDR in Australia says David speaks truth here. The buy now, pay later industry is everywhere in Australia. Yeah, it seems we imported that from y'all, and but it doesn't matter what country it's in. It's preying on poverty at the end of the day. Sean says, Hey, David, what are your thoughts on Whole Foods originally co-op and setting themselves up as a tech grocery store? I mean, I have family who worked at the very first Whole Foods here. It's an Austin company. What are my thoughts? I mean, once something grows enough like that, I mean, it's not too surprising to see. I mean, capital is unsated, and it wasn't set up in the like a pure like workers co-op way. And also, I'm not somebody who's against workers co-ops, but I think sometimes the fixation that we're going to create a competing sector with capitalism at large is not really a viable strategy. The owner of Whole Foods is a capitalist through and through. He argues for what he calls conscious capitalism, and you see where that ends up. It ends up in the arms of Whole Foods. I mean, sorry, of Amazon, right? I mean, it's not too surprising of a trajectory, maybe except for some of the folks who've been hanging around here. Remember when that was the hippie place, and now it's purely a yuppie one. Yeah, and there's a tradition here, as Garrett Olson says. Um, Recalling a really great old song, says, you load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. I owe my soul to the company store. I mean, this is exactly it. And like, this is a very basic point, but this is what is the role of debt in the capitalist economy? Well, because capitalism is a system that directs the profit from the labor that you perform as a worker into the hands of very few. Eventually, you're going to get into a crisis, as we've seen in this country after decades and decades and decades of wage stagnation, where the consumer base, the vast majority of people, aren't able to participate in the economy. And we're not even talking about buying luxury goods or, clothing or things like that. At this moment, we're talking about people struggling to buy food. So what ends up having to happen? Well, the people who own capital lend that capital back to people who have had it ripped away from them through wage theft and exploitation under capitalism at interest, and basically recycle that cash, to stimulate the economy, so that there can be an illusion of a strong purchasing consumer base. And we saw it with the explosion in credit card debt in this country, and this is no different. This is just a way to get around some of the regulations that were put in place to prevent the worst aspects of this. It's ridiculous to live in a country like this where people are going in debt to buy food. It's unbelievable. And another thing too is like, so much of the innovation under capitalism actually hasn't been as much in the modern era, hasn't been as much material innovation. But how can we find a way to sit ourselves on top of already existing activity and claw a little fee for ourselves? That has been really the legacy of the tech industry, from everything like from these pay later companies to things like Uber and Lyft, which effectively said, let's see if we can sit on top of transportation, a transportation industry or cab industry, and find ways to extract more money from those systems. And how are they able to do that? Because they have access to capital that basically allowed them to run over all of the other established taxi cab companies in the country, subsidized, until we're at a moment like we are right now, where they can no longer afford those subsidies at the same rate, and those rides are going up. So completely destroyed already existing activity, found a way to basically get new beneficiaries of that system, and we're now worse off from it. And I'm sorry, like there was a lot in there, and I almost forgot to mention. This is another example too of this inflation argument that we're talking about, and remembering like who gets hit the most. I mean, I think all of us have common experiences now, where our food budgets have gone up astronomically, as have our electricity bills, as have our water bills. I mean, life is getting much, much more expensive, and people are effectively seeing wage declines because the rate of inflation is continuing to grow, particularly on things like food and electricity in this country. So yeah, it's not surprising that these companies are shitting in, because that's what they're going to do. Setting themselves up because that's what they're going to do. But it shows that some things are very, very broken in the system, even from like a Keynesian, pro-capitalist position. our friend Trevor says, they just wanted to say, I've seen my groceries for my family go up from $200 a week to almost 300 in last year. I mean, that's a 50% um, increase. And they said we had the solution though. It was the child credits, and like those were massively popular. They were extremely helpful for people, and the Democrats couldn't even fight for them at the end of the day. It's really pathetic to realize that. Just like it boggles the mind sometimes to see how bad those people are at politics. Yeah, this is the classic. Brendan Harris says the poorest modern American has a better standard of living than the king of Spain in whatever century. Blah blah blah. I mean, that's effectively a libertarian argument, and it's completely nonsensical when you think about relative to what the if you were to compare, for example, the experience of the super rich, or even the remnants of royal families across Europe, what they're able to consume now versus what everyday people are able to. It's such a tired argument, and you see it mirrored by folks like the degrowthers, which I find to be really really ridiculous. Daredevil says, I think even intergenerational wealth is dying for the quote unquote middle class. Um, my grandfather was retired from the U.S. Navy and the VA prison system, but when he died, my grandmother was left with little. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a significant decline across the board in this country, and obviously, like working class people have been hit extremely hard. And thanks for this too. Mark says, my 76-year-old dad is poor and in permanent debt, and eats McDonald's cheeseburgers for dinner because they're cheaper than buying grocery elements separately and cooking for himself. Also in Australia. Yeah, well, appreciate that, and it's I'm sorry that that's their situation. I mean, it's truly amazing, how people try to frame these things as privilege instead of real serious examples of our decline. Benjamin Bryant says, being a fan of good music in Austin, do you like Jerry's McMurtry? He seems to be standard issue liberal personally, but his songs have some themes that dovetail with some of the themes of LR. I think McMurtry is wonderful. Absolutely. Keith says, we need postal banking. Spent a whole summer helping people at a local library set up checking accounts so they could deposit Social Security checks, and many were seniors. Yeah, I mean, when you think about the lack of access to finance that so many people have, the answer is not allowing Bank of America to establish itself more in communities. It's for the state to step in, so that we can provide these things at little to no cost to people. It's a no-brainer. Um, Also from the Twitch chat, I'm not going to read the last bit, but I'm sorry that we have the. I know I actually don't know how to fix that. On Twitch, it says I'm playing NBA 2K. That's a Matt Lack remnant. All right, well let's I have another piece of sound for everybody, and then I'd be happy to take a few more questions before we roll. We've been missing our boy James Lindsay. He's been run off of social media lately, but he's not gone. He was recently on with another loser, Andy No, and I just wanted to share what one of America's most preeminent critics of Marxism and understanders of the history of Marxist thought has to say about this philosophy, because I don't know. I'll let this clip speak for itself.
I have stepped away from kind of the classical interpretation of Marxism and the academic understanding of Marxism, that Marxism is primarily offering an economic theory.
Literally no surprise, by the way. I've stepped back from the classical understanding of Marxism, the people who study this, um, and am about to provide my own insane personal definition of what this system of thought is about.
Marx actually laid down a theology that he organized a religion, and that material conditions were the driving center of what he thought made for man's sense of being and purpose in life. And so he built a religion, and the kind of operating system that he plugged into it was economic conditions. So an economic theory got built into a religion that was an underlying theology, and that I think is something like kind of like it sounds a little silly, but like a PlayStation. A PlayStation isn't any of the games that it plays. It has the capacity to change the game out. So Marxism would be like or the PlayStation, and then what we call classical Marxism would be a particular game. But then you can take that disc out and put a different disc in, and when you put the new disc in, I know this is old. They don't use discs anymore, but bear with me. Like I don't know, cultural conditions, or like the kind of collective terms of society that's critical Marxism, or some identity politics like critical race theory or queer theory. Or post-colonial theory, then what you have the same engine, you have the same PlayStation running the game. It's just operating a different, playing a different piece of software. So I see Marxism that way, and I see all of these on this, and this has been the bulk of my work for the past 2 to 3 years, is seeing all of these movements, whether it's critical theory, whether it's cultural Marxism, whether it's postmodernism even, which is a change from when I wrote Cynical Theories, whether it's this woke stuff, the identity politics, critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonial, all of the different fat studies, all these things, I see them on the exact same continuum, and it's the exact same engine with a different, if you switch metaphors to a car, it's the exact same engine with a different body style.
It's really amazing to sit here and be like, this is what I've been spending the last 3 years of my life on, and the best that you can do is an extremely confusing and bizarre metaphor comparing again, a philosophy like Marxism with things that are incoherent to Marxism. Again, critical race theory, something like we talk a lot about the right wing freak out about it because they're basically including any kind of conversation about American history or politics as critical race theory. But critical race theory, like as a discipline, is something that is in deep tension with Marxism, because the Marxist analysis, for example, of racism in this country begins with the recognition of why those systems were set up on a material and political basis to benefit a slaveocracy in the South, and a northern financial industry that benefited tremendously from it. And without understanding those things, you're very often to miss one, where they came from, and two, what we can do about them. Because if we're just talking about the questions in people's hearts and souls, we're doing idealism, which is a very different political philosophy than materialism, right? So, like, I don't know why I tried to like fix James's arguments for him, and but it's tough sometimes because you hear something like that, and you want to start to critique it, but it does operate on such a level of abstraction and absurdity that you sometimes have to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and try to tweak some of his arguments to make it make a little bit of damn sense. Again, like, he pulls together a whole group of philosophy and theory, and tries to attribute it all to Marxism, when a lot of these things, from a lot of post-colonialism, from critical race theory, from critical theory, were all criticisms of Marxism, saying, well, Marx missed this, Marx missed that. So we have to actually eradicate a lot of those ways of understanding the world and build something new. And some of them are a little bit closer. Like, for example, like, Frankfurt School comes out of a lot of people who are Marxists, but then they import a lot of cultural arguments that have very little standing, and then politically end up making these kind of incoherent arguments, where no longer is it a question of engaging with the working class in like a kind of traditional Marxist or Leninist model, but rather recognizing or arguing that all of these different social fights that we're having in this country are inherently have the same potential to fundamentally change the economic relations of the system. And we've seen that tradition, while being very beneficial on some levels, was exceptionally weak. And I think most Marxists, myself included, see that turn into the university, into critical theory, as actually being a very serious repudiation of Marxism that has left this movement much weaker. But to go back to the tortured PlayStation example, even saying that classical Marxism, like the theories that Marx was saying, was just one disc that is going into this overall system, I mean, is truly like the crux of James Lindsay's misunderstanding and willful misunderstanding of Marxism. Where I've watched enough of his stuff to basically get, and we read through most of his terrible book on Marxism, to basically get what he basically sees as Marxism, as in that system, the PlayStation that's playing all these different discs. It's oppressor versus oppressed, right? And he thinks that was Marx's contribution to political economy and political philosophy. And I'm sorry, Bub, but that is the most bullshit answer ever. That's Christianity. That is classical Greek philosophy, right? Is a recognition that there are different forces. Marxism is not the first group, or like the first idea to say there are different classes, or that there are good and evil, that there are tensions within society, right? That's Manichaeism, right? Like, these are not unique to Marxism. What Marx argued, and where he was a flip on like Hegel, for example, was that he recognized that capitalism, through its structure, produces two classes, right? Again, not even on its own, like the radical understanding, but he makes the argument that because the proletariat, the working class, is the agent that produces the majority of value in society, that they have this revolutionary kernel within them, where they have the potential, as a class that is growing, as more and more people exited feudalism and were brought into capitalism, have the potential to build a different system where there is no need to have somebody sitting on top of economic production like we do under capitalism, in essence, the capitalist class, that we could eradicate them. And it's not a given. It's not a teleology. I mean, a lot of times people accuse Marx of teleology. And if you watched the short, I guess half an hour, short, or whatever you want to call that, the first part of the documentary that we've been doing on what was left populism, you see very clearly that Marx was not a teleological thinker. That if any kind of teleology that you can accuse Marxism of, it was something that was imported into Marxism by others much later. Why? Because they were reading American capitalist economists who were making arguments, for example, that the United States had accumulated to the full extent, that the American markets needed to expand and take over, other countries in South America to capture those markets, right? Which Lenin turns into the theory of imperialism, right? And it's not that, the theory of imperialism is necessarily wrong, because it's true that the American capitalist state, being pushed by economists, was doing these things to pursue new markets. But it's also completely wrong to sit here and say America was in like its late stage of capitalism in the 1800s, before the West had been fully brought into the capitalist mode of production, before the mineral wealth of places like California, for example, had been fully incorporated into the capitalist markets, right? This is something that is, again, I don't know why I'm treating James as like a legitimate interlocutor on these questions, but I think it's helpful for us to also understand exactly why what he's saying is just so flat out wrong. Um, but yeah, let me. I'd love to see some more some questions and comments from y'all. So I'll scroll up and take a few more before we're done. That James shit gets me so heated sometimes, if I'm being honest. By analogy, capitalism is Google Stadia. No one wants that shit except for Google. So yeah, that might be a good one. Um, Imus says, call Marxism a video game is such dismissive bullshit. Is he naturally that stupid, or does he get paid to be such a cartoon character? Well, he's found some ways to make money. You got to remember, James Lindsay, he wanted to be a new atheist. But by the time he started writing his books criticizing Christianity, that ship had sort of sailed. At least it's something that you could sort of jump in on and be a Harris or Daniel Dennett or Dawkins or Hitchens. So he tried to find a new thing, and he first started with being a woke critic, and then flipped over to Marxism. But I always say that, like, the reason that Lindsay has any sense of popularity, apart from right wingers like No and their ilk, who want to use him to push like a very, very paranoid view of American politics to encourage their people to do God knows what. Another reason that people like him have some popularity is because I think a lot of people are interested in understanding Marxism, not necessarily as people who like are attracted to it, but they want to understand this because our school system and our education system in this country, and because there's been a lack of socialist movements in this country, there's not a lot of information out there for people. And that's why what James does is actually so dangerous, because he gets a large enough audience, and he just promotes his nonsensical stuff, which maybe to a layperson, somebody who's never experienced this or spent a lot of time talking to a socialist who really understands these things, he can seem a little bit convincing to folks. Yeah, the Mark Lamont Hill with Lindsay was something else, and like that's the thing too, is he's scared to debate folks. He just spent a long time, calling everyone groomer and clown. That was the extent of his debate. Um, and Jemp says he thinks Marxism is like Christianity. Marx is the stand-in for the unmoved mover, or some weird shit. Yeah, I mean it's bizarre, the kind of stuff that he's pulled it in here. Sean says, "Why do these conservatives keep trying to bring gamers with their analogies? Because they know their base." um. Also, I'm down to talk about anything. So if anyone has any other kind of questions or things that you want to talk about, feel free to jump in with those. I got a couple minutes. I can go, but we'll see how rich the chat is. Um, Of course, James Lindsay shows up with an antique sword to a fully automated gunfight. For him, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Black Brit says, I don't know about Marx, but many people seem to talk in a logical manner about workers and the working class. And I think that's true. And, not the whole, but I think there's definitely a tendency to do that. And I think it's extremely damaging. Um, you know, People oftentimes sort of um, turn Marxism into a determinist philosophy when it absolutely certainly isn't. I mean, again, I do suggest people check out the documentary that we put out on some of the early history of Marxism, to sort of set up the stage for our conversation on what was left populism, talk about the Corbyn, the Bernie, and the Syriza movement. Um, but totally, I mean, there is, there has been these kind of, if not fully teleological or determinist understandings of Marxism, very, very sympathetic to that kind of understanding that, like, the revolution is just going to happen, is around the corner. Inherently, it led to a very, very crucial mistake in the Soviet Union, where they thought if they could just hold on, then the revolution was imminent in Europe, particularly in Germany. And as you've seen, that did not create the best social system, and it had tragic, tragic consequences. So I don't think that it's absent necessarily in like the big tradition. But where is it rooted in? A lot of this stuff, like the more theoretical aspect of it, was coming from the fact that a lot of Marxists in the late 1890s and early 1900s were reading American bourgeois economists. Leo Panish talks about that very, very well. If people are interested in that, send me a message. I can send you some YouTube video, or lectures that he did that you can watch on YouTube on this. But yeah, I think that deterministic aspect is certainly there in a kind of I don't know, like the pop Marxism, if you get what I mean, just sort of people who are absorbing things and not really reading and rooting themselves in these texts and these ideas. There has been a development of a kind of determinism that's not material. One of the things that I think, one of the interventions that I keep on trying to remind folks is that like no one is born with class consciousness. Class consciousness is a potential of the working class, but it's actually something that's created consciously, constructed, because there are a lot of other consciousnesses that are out there, identities that are out there, that are vying for people's um, heads, for the way that they understand the world. And like I think that socialists really need to understand that this is why political education is really important. This is why organization is really important. And this kind of fantasy idea that people are just going to wake up one day um, is ludicrous. And it's not helpful at all for the movement. And you see it a lot online. Um, Imus says, "Do you think Marxist theorists should use the teleological approach?" I think I sort of was touching on that a second ago. I don't think that's very helpful. I think um, one, because it makes you make bad calls, and two, because it rejects agency and the important work of actually building structures and institutions and movements. Right? If you just think these things are coming, and it's just a matter of when. Um, you're not going to be thinking strategically in the long term about actually how to bring those things about. And it was something that we really understood in the socialist movement in this country for a long time. If you read Debs, if you read some of the early American socialists, and somewhere along the way, people really did lose that, understanding that these movements have to be consciously constructed. They're not just going to materialize out of nowhere. And if you read the end of the Communist Manifesto, it's a roaring call, um, but it's a demand. Workers of the world unite, right? It's an active call, not a passive. Like the workers, Marx doesn't say the workers of the world are going to unite. He's saying to working people, it's time to do this. Obviously, there's richer aspects to that theory, but I'm just saying, like in the most political pamphlet, like in the one that was supposed to be handed out around people to inspire them to enact change and organize. It's not a prediction as much as it is a demand. It's a call to do something, and somewhere along the way that has been lost. Let's see. um How do you talk to family and friends who have been or suspicious of socialism, etc., about these ideas without using the words in Marxism that trigger people to not listen? I mean, I think that we get like a form of this question a lot. I think you just need to talk to people like normal folks. I mean, I don't really know what other way to put it. I mean, I think that I do a decent job of that on this program. Not pat myself on the back too much. Um, if you're using terminology that people don't understand or have a lot of stuff baked into it, you're making a communication error. But at the same time, I don't like this tendency of people be like, well, we're going to do like to use the term the right's been using lately, which I love, secret Marxism. Where it's like we're just going to use different names for things and hide what you think. I think it's worthwhile to say I think this way. I am a socialist. I am a Marxist, and explain in common sense, common understanding terminology what that means in real life examples for them. Like it's almost a universal experience that most people don't like their boss. That's a great place to start and talk about that dynamic. That's something that's experienced across the political spectrum. Like these are entryway points. If you want to get more historic or zoomed out a little bit, talk about the class system in this country. Talk about who gets bailed out. Talk about who gets protected and who suffers. Right? These are things that most people, I feel like, have a intuitive understanding, or at least are aware of. And what Marxism does is unite these kind of individual experiences that you have into something that's collective and historical. And like that's, I think, the way to think about it. iMyth from the Twitch chat says, David, what are your thoughts on the libertarian use of logical reasoning, especially when they regard logical structures as the best possible way to discuss political matters? Well, I don't think like logic itself is not necessarily the problem, but I mean, the libertarian stuff with that. Um, the fascination with that on their side goes with their over reliance on abstraction, right? If you ever talk to a libertarian, they never really want to talk about concrete historical examples, the development of capitalism, the way that the system has actually functioned, right? Which is like, again, like if you read like Marx, if you read Capital, it is not this people think it's just like a long political tirade of Marx being like workers are being hurt and we need to fight for them and the bosses are bad. No, it is a rich text looking at the production of basic materials. How do you produce a coat? What is London Capital doing? Right? It's very much rooted in the world and in history and in economics, not in an abstracted way, right? Where everything operates in like this kind of perfectly enclosed um in this enclosed world that oftentimes has little to no bearing on what's actually been happening or what's happened historically, right? Marxism introduces those things into the conversation where a lot of these kinds of you know libertarian economists and more importantly libertarian debaters, like they like to operate there, right? And I think this is why like moving from abstracted reality into material reality is a much better way to think about the world. And what Marxism gives you is a analytical tool to look at the world and to look at things as they are happening, um, so that you can understand them better. While libertarianism, particularly like the popular online versions of that or the debate pro online versions of that, um, only can operate from abstraction and a kind of separation of their arguments from the world that's being experienced and that we can actually measure and understand. And I appreciate you too, iMyth. Do you think child tax credits could return should Democrats hold the House and win more seats on the Senate? I mean, Lord, I hope so. I mean, that's just a no brainer for them. Um, I I doubt that without a significant push from like the people at large that they'll be inclined to do it. But it seems like something that could be a possibility. But again, like that won't come from them as much as it will come from people demanding it, which is how they operate, and they always like to to water these things down. As you see with the student loan debate. Let's see. Well, let's I think Strom says it well. He says we can't play games of sneakiness. We must be polite but unabashed. I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of folks there's a fix there's for example, Bernie Sanders running as a socialist and saying that he was a socialist versus just being like I'm a progressive was immensely helpful. And I think that like when you see these kind of ideological barriers, I don't think the best thing to do is to run shoulder charging into them. But people can tell when you're trying to be a little bit sneaky to them when you're talking to them. And I think that this tendency to overthink it, instead of saying like, well, we need to do is have, you know, models and a movement and understandings of history and politics and economics to make these arguments stronger. Um, this kind of fixation that, well, all we need to do is change the language, I think is wrong. Because once somebody starts figuring out where you're coming from, they're gonna be like, well, why is this person lying to me, right? And that's a bad way to start any kind of conversation with somebody on any topic. Um, all right, y'all. I think I'm gonna run. But I'm always happy to hear from everybody. I will, if you have anything that you feel like was missed or something you want to hear us cover on the show, always feel free to reach out to us. We got some fun stuff coming up the next couple of weeks. Reminding folks, Los Angeles. We're going to be in Los Angeles October 23rd, at the Terragram Ballroom. We're going to be there with Ben Burgess, Anna Kasparian, Nando Villa, Jason Miles of This Is Revolution, Danny Bessner, and a few other wonderful folks. So be sure to grab your tickets and come see me and Matt Leck out there for our first live show. Really looking forward to all of that. And I think Matt will be on tomorrow in the evening. So be sure to go say hello to him from me. And as always, take care. If you want to get a nice little Left Reckoning cap, you can grab them at leftreckoning.com/store. But until next week, I'll see you around.